The champagne bubbles fizzed against my lips as I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Meridian Tower's 42nd floor, watching the city lights twinkle below like scattered diamonds. The annual holiday party at Pinnacle Financial was in full swing, and for the first time in 3 years, I actually had something to celebrate. The promotion to Senior Investment Analyst had been announced just that morning, complete with a corner office and a salary that would finally let me pay off my student loans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Well, came a voice dripping with false sweetness behind me. I turned to see Cassandra Hartwell approaching, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a martini glass, her signature red lipstick forming what could generously be called a smile. Behind her trailed her usual entourage, 2 junior analysts who hung on her every word like gospel. If it isn't our newest senior analyst. Hello, Cassandra, I replied evenly, taking another sip of champagne. Despite working in the same department for over 2 years, our interactions had always been strained. Where I preferred to let my work speak for itself, Cassandra thrived on office politics and strategic networking. You know, she continued, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby colleagues to hear, I have to say, Natasha, I'm truly impressed by your rapid advancement. The way she emphasized rapid made my stomach tighten. I mean, some of us have been grinding away with our CFAs and MBAs for years, putting in 60-hour weeks, sacrificing our social lives for quarterly reports and client presentations. I felt the conversation around us beginning to quiet, that subtle shift that happens when people sense drama brewing. The holiday music seemed to fade into background noise as Cassandra's words hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. And here you come, she continued, gesturing with her martini in a way that made the olive nearly escape its toothpick prison, straight out of some state school program, and boom, corner office, senior position, probably making more than analysts who've been here since the Clinton administration. Her laugh was sharp, cutting through the ambient party chatter like a blade. My colleague James Morrison shifted uncomfortably beside the appetizer table, while Sarah Chen from accounting suddenly found her phone intensely fascinating. The group of junior associates near the bar had gone completely silent, their eyes darting between Cassandra and me like spectators at a tennis match. I'm not sure what you're implying, Cassandra, I said carefully, though my pulse was beginning to quicken. 3 years of workplace diplomacy had taught me to navigate these treacherous waters, but something in her tone suggested we were heading into uncharted territory. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if she had shouted. Oh, come on, Natasha. We're all adults here. Let's call a spade a spade. Her eyes traveled deliberately from my face down to my outfit and back up again, a gesture so loaded with implication that several people nearby actually took a step back. You're young, you're attractive, you've got that whole girl next door thing working for you, she continued, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her theme. And let's be honest, in a company where 90% of the executive team consists of men over 45, well, certain advantages become pretty obvious, don't they? The words hit me like a physical blow. Around us, the party continued. Someone laughed too loudly at the bar, the jazz quartet kept playing their rendition of The Way You Look Tonight, and the catering staff continued circulating with their silver trays. But in our little corner of the celebration, time seemed to have frozen solid. You think I got promoted because of how I look? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Part of me couldn't believe she had actually said it out loud, while another part, the part that had endured subtle comments and meaningful glances for years, wasn't surprised at all. I think, Cassandra replied, pausing to take a long sip of her martini for dramatic effect, that some people have to work twice as hard to get half as far, while others. She shrugged eloquently, well, let's just say they have other assets to leverage. The circle of onlookers had grown larger now. I could see David Park from the trading floor pretending to examine the hors d'oeuvres while obviously listening to every word. Michelle Rodriguez from Human Resources was frozen halfway through reaching for a canopy, her expression a mixture of horror and fascination. In that moment, standing in my black cocktail dress that I'd carefully selected to be professional yet festive, holding a glass of champagne that had suddenly lost all its sparkle, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something colder, more calculating. Something that reminded me of the feeling I'd had during my graduate thesis defense, when a particularly condescending professor had suggested that my research was ambitious for someone with my background. That's an interesting perspective, I said slowly, setting my champagne glass down on the nearby window ledge with deliberate precision. The gesture was simple, but somehow it commanded the attention of everyone within earshot. Tell me, Cassandra, what do you think qualifies someone for a senior analyst position at a firm like Pinnacle Financial? She blinked, clearly not expecting the question to be turned back on her. Well, obviously, advanced education, relevant certifications, proven track record, analytical skills. I nodded thoughtfully. And you think I lack those qualifications? What happened next would not only silence Cassandra Hartwell permanently but also set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just my career, but the entire culture of our department. Because what Cassandra didn't know, what none of them knew, because I had never felt the need to announce it, was about to become very, very public. But before I tell you exactly how I dismantled her assumptions piece by piece in front of half the company, you might be wondering why so many talented women still face these kinds of undermining comments in professional settings. If this story resonates with you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. I share strategies every week for navigating workplace challenges and proving your worth when others try to diminish it. Now, let me tell you what happened when I decided to show Cassandra exactly what qualifications I brought to the table. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My name is Natasha Rivera, and until that moment at the holiday party, I had spent 3 years at Pinnacle Financial believing that hard work and results would speak louder than office gossip. I was wrong. Standing there with Cassandra's words echoing in my mind, certain advantages become pretty obvious. I felt the familiar sting of every subtle slight I had endured since joining the company. The weight of those 3 years crashed over me like a wave, each memory now recontextualized through the lens of what my colleagues apparently really thought about my success. I remembered my first week at Pinnacle, fresh out of graduate school, when senior partner Harrison Blackstone had introduced me to a client as our newest addition to the team, while somehow managing to emphasize that I would be bringing a fresh perspective to their portfolio management. At the time, I had interpreted fresh perspective as a compliment about my innovative analytical approaches. Now I wondered what he had really meant. There was the time last spring when I had identified a critical flaw in the Westfield municipal bond analysis that would have cost the firm nearly $2 million. I had worked through 3 consecutive weekends, cross-referencing municipal tax records with projected revenue streams, building financial models that painted a clear picture of the investment's hidden risks. When I presented my findings to the executive committee, the reaction had been interesting. Impressive attention to detail, Managing Director Robert Crawford had said, his smile just a little too warm, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. You really went above and beyond on this one, Natasha. We're lucky to have someone so dedicated on the team. I had left that meeting feeling proud of my thoroughness and analytical rigor. Now, replaying Crawford's tone and the meaningful glances exchanged between the male executives, I wondered if they had attributed my success to something entirely different than the 60-hour weeks I had invested in that analysis. Then there were the smaller moments, the ones I had dismissed as harmless or even friendly at the time. Like when client Thomas Mitchell had specifically requested that I attend all his portfolio review meetings, insisting that I had just the right touch for explaining complex investment strategies. Or when venture capitalist Gregory Walsh had complimented my natural gift for making numbers accessible, while somehow managing to mention my appearance in the same conversation. I thought about the promotion announcement itself, just 12 hours earlier. When department head Linda Thornfield had called me into her office to deliver the news, she had spent considerable time emphasizing how the promotion would put me in front of more clients and how my interpersonal skills made me uniquely qualified for the increased client-facing responsibilities. At the time, I had focused on the recognition of my analytical capabilities and leadership potential. But now Cassandra's implications cast everything in a different light. Had Linda promoted me because of my financial modeling expertise and strategic thinking, or because she thought having an attractive young woman in client meetings would benefit the firm's business development? The worst part wasn't just the retroactive doubt about my accomplishments, it was the realization of what I had sacrificed to achieve them. While other women my age were enjoying their 20s, building relationships, traveling, pursuing hobbies, I had been hunched over financial statements until midnight, spending Saturdays in the office building comparative analyses, using vacation days to attend professional development seminars. I had graduated magna cum laude with my master's in financial economics, completing a thesis on emerging market volatility that had been published in the Journal of International Finance. I had passed the Chartered Financial Analyst exam on my first attempt, scoring in the 95th percentile. I held Series 7, 63, and 66 licenses, and had completed advanced certifications in risk management and portfolio theory. But none of that mattered now, standing in the golden glow of the party lights while Cassandra's accusation hung in the air like toxic gas. In her narrative, all of my education, all of my expertise, all of those late nights and sacrificed weekends were irrelevant. I was just another pretty face who had charmed her way into a position she didn't deserve. The personal cost went beyond professional doubt. I thought about the relationships I had avoided, partly from time constraints but also from a deliberate choice to maintain absolute professional boundaries. I had declined invitations to after-work drinks, kept conversations strictly business-focused, and maintained a careful distance from male colleagues to ensure that no one could ever question my motivations or theirs. I had been so careful, so strategic about my professional image. I wore conservative suits, spoke in measured tones during meetings, backed up every suggestion with data and research. I had thought I was building a reputation based on competence and reliability. Instead, apparently, my colleagues had been attributing my success to entirely different factors. Standing there in that moment, with half the party now openly watching our exchange, I felt the crushing weight of imposter syndrome that I had worked so hard to overcome. The voice in my head that whispered, "Maybe they're right, maybe you don't belong here," grew louder with each passing second. But underneath the doubt and hurt, something else was building. Something that reminded me of the determination that had carried me through graduate school while working 2 part-time jobs. Something that had sustained me through the CFA exam preparation while my friends were enjoying summer weekends. Something that had driven me to excel in every position I had ever held, despite starting from a background where no one in my family had ever worked in finance. Cassandra was still standing there, martini in hand, waiting for my response with the confident smile of someone who believed she had delivered a killing blow. The crowd around us seemed to lean in closer, collectively holding their breath for what would happen next. What they didn't know, what Cassandra was about to learn in the most public way possible, was that some fires, when you try to smother them, don't go out. They explode. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, and I could feel the weight of every gaze in our corner of the room. Cassandra's martini glass caught the light as she raised it to her lips, her expression radiating the satisfaction of someone who believed she had just delivered the perfect verbal strike. The jazz quartet continued their rendition of "Fly Me to the Moon," but the melody felt distant and surreal against the tension crackling around us. I looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, the jewelry that spoke of family money rather than earned success, the perfectly styled hair that required weekly salon appointments. Cassandra Hartwell had joined Pinnacle Financial 18 months after me, armed with an MBA from her father's alma mater and a network of connections that opened doors before she even had to knock. In that moment, staring into her self-satisfied expression, something crystallized in my mind with startling clarity. This wasn't just about tonight's insult. This was about every woman who had ever been told she didn't earn her position, every professional who had been reduced to their appearance rather than their achievements, every person who had worked twice as hard only to be told they had taken some imaginary shortcut. "You know what, Cassandra," I said, my voice carrying a new note of steel that seemed to surprise even me. "You're absolutely right about one thing." Her eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not expecting agreement. Around us, the eavesdropping crowd shifted with renewed interest. I could see James Morrison actually lean forward from his position by the appetizer table, while Sarah Chen had completely abandoned any pretense of looking at her phone. "Some people do have to work twice as hard to get half as far," I continued, setting my champagne glass down with deliberate precision. "But I think we have very different ideas about who those people are." Cassandra's smile faltered just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, please. Don't tell me you're going to play the victim card now." We all know how this game works. Do we? I asked, genuinely curious. Tell me, what exactly do you think this game is? She gestured broadly with her free hand, nearly spilling her martini in the process. Come on, Natasha. Pretty young woman joins male-dominated firm, gets fast-tracked for promotion, lands the corner office everyone else has been working toward for years. It's the oldest story in the book. The words hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigarette, and I felt something shift inside me, not anger, exactly, but something colder and more focused. It was the same feeling I'd had during my thesis defense when Professor Williams had suggested that my research on emerging market volatility was overly ambitious for someone from a state school background. It was the feeling I'd had when my undergraduate advisor had tried to steer me toward more appropriate career paths in teaching or social work. It was the feeling of being underestimated by someone who had never bothered to look beneath the surface. The oldest story in the book, I repeated thoughtfully, as if testing the phrase for flavor. That's interesting. You know what story I think is even older? Cassandra waited, her confidence beginning to show hairline cracks around the edges. The story of someone who inherited their opportunities dismissing everyone else's achievements as unearned, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. The story of someone who mistakes privilege for merit, connections for competence. A flush began to creep up Cassandra's neck, but she held her ground. I earned everything I have. Did you? I asked. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Tell me about your path to Pinnacle Financial. The crowd around us had grown larger now. I could see Managing Director Robert Crawford himself hovering near the bar, his conversation with the clients from Meridian Holdings clearly forgotten as he focused on our exchange. Michelle Rodriguez from HR had materialized seemingly from nowhere, her expression a mixture of fascination and professional concern. I don't need to justify my qualifications to you, Cassandra replied, but there was a defensive edge to her voice now. Of course not, I agreed pleasantly. Just like I don't need to justify mine to you. But since you've made my qualifications a topic of public discussion, I think it's only fair that we examine the standards you're applying. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the faces surrounding us, colleagues who had worked alongside me for 3 years, some of whom were now seeing me in an entirely different light. Not as the quiet, hard-working analyst who stayed late to perfect her reports, but as someone willing to stand her ground when challenged. You mentioned earlier that some people have CFAs and MBAs, that they put in 60-hour weeks and sacrifice their social lives, I continued. You painted a picture of dedication and expertise being overlooked in favor of, what was it you called them? Other assets? Cassandra's grip on her martini glass tightened visibly. I never said. Oh, but you did, I interrupted gently. In front of all these witnesses. You made it very clear what you think my assets are and why you believe I received this promotion. The holiday party continued around us, but our corner had become its own separate universe. Even the catering staff seemed to be moving more slowly as they passed our area, clearly reluctant to miss whatever was about to unfold. Here's what I find fascinating about your theory, I said, taking a half-step closer to Cassandra. It requires you to believe that every single person involved in promotion decisions at this firm, Linda Thornfield, Robert Crawford, Harrison Blackstone, the entire executive committee, is so unprofessional, so incompetent at their jobs, that they would risk the firm's reputation and their own careers to promote someone based on appearance rather than merit. Cassandra's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Think about what you're actually suggesting, I continued, my voice gaining momentum like a runaway train. You're saying that Pinnacle Financial, a firm that manages over $12 billion in assets, that serves institutional clients who trust us with their pension funds and endowments, makes senior personnel decisions the way teenagers choose prom dates. Around us, several people shifted uncomfortably. I could see Robert Crawford's expression growing increasingly stern as the implications of Cassandra's accusations sank in. After all, she wasn't just insulting me. She was suggesting that the entire leadership structure of the firm was fundamentally corrupt and incompetent. That's not what I meant, Cassandra said quickly, finally realizing the hole she had dug for herself. Isn't it? I asked. Because if my promotion was based on anything other than my qualifications and performance, that would make everyone who approved it complicit in professional misconduct. Is that really the position you want to take? The silence that followed was deafening. Even the jazz quartet seemed to pause between songs, as if the entire party was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Cassandra looked around desperately, suddenly aware that her audience was no longer sympathetic. The junior analysts who had been hanging on her every word earlier were now studying their shoes with intense concentration. Even her closest allies in the office seemed to be developing sudden interest in the appetizer selection. I think, I said quietly, it's time we talked about qualifications. What happened next would not only expose Cassandra's assumptions as completely unfounded, but also reveal something about my background that no one at Pinnacle Financial knew, something that would change how every single person in that room saw both of us forever. The champagne had gone flat in my abandoned glass, but my mind had never been clearer. Looking at Cassandra's increasingly uncomfortable expression, I realized that this moment had been building for 3 years, not just tonight's confrontation, but every subtle dismissal, every questioning glance, every assumption that had been made about my place at Pinnacle Financial. You want to talk about qualifications? I said, my voice carrying across our corner of the party with newfound authority. Let me tell you about my journey to this position, Cassandra. Not the version you've apparently invented, but the actual story. I could see Linda Thornfield, our department head, making her way through the crowd toward us, her expression unreadable but her pace deliberate. Behind her, Harrison Blackstone had abandoned his conversation with the Meridian Holdings clients entirely, his silver eyebrows drawn together in concentration as he focused on our exchange. My name is Natasha Rivera, I began, addressing not just Cassandra but the entire circle of colleagues who had gathered around us. I grew up in Riverside Heights, about 40 minutes east of here, in a neighborhood where most families considered it an achievement if their kids graduated high school without getting arrested or pregnant. Cassandra's face flickered with something, surprise, maybe, or discomfort at the personal turn the conversation had taken. She had been expecting a professional sparring match, not an autobiography. My father, Miguel Rivera, worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, days at the Consolidated Steel plant and evenings cleaning office buildings downtown. My mother, Carmen, took care of 3 kids while running a small alterations business out of our basement. I paused, letting the reality of my background sink in. Neither of them graduated from college. In fact, neither of them graduated from high school. The crowd around us had grown completely silent now. Even the ambient party noise seemed muted, as if the entire gathering was leaning in to hear my story. I could see James Morrison's expression shifting from curious to genuinely surprised. Apparently my background wasn't what anyone had imagined. When I was 14, I continued, my father was injured in an industrial accident. Crushed vertebrae, permanent disability, workers' compensation that barely covered our rent. We went from struggling to make ends meet to genuinely not knowing if we'd have electricity from month to month. I looked directly at Cassandra, whose designer dress and inherited confidence suddenly seemed almost garish in the context of what I was sharing. That's when I learned my first lesson about merit versus circumstance. My parents could have given up, could have accepted that our family story was destined to be one of limitation and struggle. Instead, they made a decision that changed everything. The jazz quartet had finished their set and was packing up their instruments, but no one in our area seemed to notice. Even the catering staff had slowed their circulation, clearly sensing that something significant was unfolding. They decided that education would be our family's way out, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. Not just for me, but for my younger brothers as well. So while my father underwent months of physical therapy and learned to walk again, my mother took on additional alterations work, sometimes sewing until 2 or 3 in the morning to pay for my SAT prep courses. Cassandra shifted uncomfortably, her martini glass now empty but still clutched in her manicured fingers like a shield. Behind her, I could see Robert Crawford listening intently, his expression having shifted from professional interest to something approaching respect. I graduated valedictorian from Riverside High School, I continued, with a 4.0 GPA that I maintained while working 20 hours a week at the local grocery store to help with family expenses. I earned a full academic scholarship to State University, not because of my connections or my family's donations, but because I scored in the 99th percentile on both the SAT and ACT. The silence around us was so complete that I could hear the software of the building's ventilation system, the distant sound of traffic 42 floors below. Linda Thornfield had reached the edge of our circle now, but she made no move to interrupt, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene unfolding before her. At State University, I double-majored in economics and mathematics, I said, my voice taking on the cadence of someone who had learned to present complex information clearly and persuasively. I maintained a 3.97 GPA while working as a teaching assistant for undergraduate statistics courses and tutoring struggling students to pay for textbooks and living expenses. I saw Sarah Chen from accounting nod slightly, as if recognizing something familiar in my story. Perhaps she, too, had worked her way through school, had understood the particular exhaustion of balancing academic excellence with financial necessity. During my junior year, I was selected for a competitive internship at Regional Investment Partners downtown. Not through family connections or networking events, but through a merit-based selection process that included written examinations, case study presentations, and interviews with senior partners. Cassandra's face had gone pale now, and I could see her beginning to understand that this story wasn't going where she had expected. The narrative of the pretty young woman who had charmed her way into success was crumbling with each detail I shared. That internship taught me two crucial things, I continued. First, that I had a natural aptitude for financial analysis and risk assessment. And second, that the world of institutional finance was filled with brilliant, driven people who would judge me entirely on my ability to deliver results. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the faces surrounding us, colleagues who had worked with me for 3 years but were now hearing my full story for the first time. After graduation, I was accepted into the master's program in financial economics at State University's graduate school. Again, not through legacy admissions or family influence, but based on my undergraduate performance, my GRE scores, and a research proposal on emerging market volatility that impressed the admissions committee. Robert Crawford stepped forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. As someone who had built his own career on emerging market strategies, he would understand the complexity and importance of that research area. Graduate school was where I truly found my calling, I said, my passion for the subject beginning to show through my controlled delivery. I spent 2 years diving deep into the mathematical models that govern international capital flows, studying the psychological and structural factors that drive market volatility in developing economies. The crowd around us seemed to lean in closer, drawn by the genuine enthusiasm in my voice. Even Cassandra appeared to be listening intently now, though her expression remained guarded. My thesis advisor was Dr. Elizabeth Chen, no relation to Sarah here, I added with a small smile toward our accounting colleague, one of the most respected experts in international finance. She didn't care about my background or my family's economic status. She cared about whether I could think critically, whether I could synthesize complex information, and whether I could contribute original insights to the field. What I was about to reveal next would not only validate everything I had just shared, but also demonstrate exactly how far off base Cassandra's assumptions had been. The credentials I was about to present weren't just impressive, they were the kind of qualifications that most people in our industry only dreamed of achieving. The weight of everyone's attention felt almost physical as I continued, but I had passed the point of no return. Cassandra had opened this door, and now she was going to see exactly what lay behind it. Around us, the holiday party had essentially split into two distinct events, the formal celebration continuing in the main area, and our increasingly intense corner discussion that had become its own gravitational center. My master's thesis, I said, my voice carrying the confidence that comes from knowing your subject matter intimately, was titled Behavioral Finance and Systemic Risk in Emerging Market Currency Crises, a quantitative analysis of contagion effects during the 2008 to 2012 period. It was a 347-page analysis that took me 18 months to complete. I could see Robert Crawford's eyebrows rise with genuine interest. Currency crisis analysis was his particular area of expertise, and I knew he would understand the complexity of what I was describing. Linda Thornfield had moved closer as well, her sharp business mind clearly engaged by the academic rigor I was outlining. The research involved building mathematical models to predict how psychological factors, investor panic, herd behavior, risk aversion clustering, could amplify economic fundamentals to create cascading currency collapses across seemingly unrelated markets, I continued, warming to the subject despite the confrontational context. I analyzed over 2,000 data points across 47 emerging market economies, using regression analysis, Monte Carlo simulations, and behavioral modeling techniques. Cassandra's grip on her empty martini glass had tightened visibly. Whatever response she had been prepared for, it clearly wasn't a detailed academic lecture delivered with the authority of genuine expertise. The mathematical framework I developed identified 3 key variables that could predict currency crisis contagion with 87% accuracy, significantly higher than existing models at the time, I said, allowing a note of pride to enter my voice. Dr. Chen submitted the research for publication, and it was accepted by the Journal of International Financial Economics after peer review. Several people in our audience shifted with surprise. The Journal of International Financial Economics wasn't some obscure academic publication, it was one of the most respected research venues in our field. Getting published there as a graduate student was the kind of achievement that typically led to tenure-track positions at major universities. The research caught the attention of several institutions, I continued, including the International Monetary Fund, which invited me to present my findings at their annual Emerging Markets Symposium in Washington. I was 24 years old, standing in front of central bank governors and finance ministers from around the world, explaining how psychological contagion effects could be quantified and potentially mitigated. I paused, letting that image sink in, a young woman from Riverside Heights, whose father worked in a steel plant, addressing some of the most powerful financial officials in the world. The contrast with Cassandra's narrative about my advantages couldn't have been more stark. After completing my master's degree, with highest honors, I should mention, I had several options, I said, my voice taking on a more businesslike tone. I could have pursued a PhD and an academic career. The University of Chicago offered me a full fellowship for their doctoral program in behavioral economics. Goldman Sachs extended an offer for their analyst program in New York. Deutsche Bank wanted me for their emerging markets desk in London. The mention of these prestigious opportunities sent another ripple of surprise through the crowd. These weren't positions that people stumbled into through networking or appearance, they required demonstrated analytical brilliance and academic achievement at the highest levels. But I chose Pinnacle Financial, I said, looking directly at Cassandra, because during my interview process, I was impressed by the firm's commitment to rigorous analysis and evidence-based decision-making. Linda Thornfield convinced me that this was a place where ideas mattered more than pedigree, where innovation was valued over connections. Linda's expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught the slight nod of acknowledgement. She remembered our interview conversations, the detailed discussions about my research and its practical applications to portfolio management and risk assessment. My first assignment at Pinnacle was analyzing the risk profile of our emerging market bond portfolio, I continued, my voice gaining momentum as I detailed my professional accomplishments. I discovered that our existing models were underestimating correlation risks during stress periods. Essentially, we were assuming that bonds from different emerging markets would behave independently during crises, when my research had shown they were actually highly correlated during periods of investor panic. Robert Crawford was nodding now, clearly following the technical discussion and understanding its implications. A mistake in emerging market correlation assumptions could cost a firm millions of dollars during a market downturn. I redesigned our risk management framework for the entire emerging market portfolio, I said, implementing dynamic correlation models that adjusted based on volatility clustering and stress indicators. The new framework reduced our value at risk by 37% while actually improving our expected returns. The silence around us was no longer just attention, it was the kind of focused quiet that occurs when people are genuinely learning something important. Even the junior analysts who typically hung on Cassandra's every word were listening intently, perhaps beginning to understand that there were different ways to achieve success in this industry. Over the following 18 months, I applied similar analytical rigor to our municipal bond portfolio, our corporate debt strategies, and our equity risk models, I continued. Each time, I identified systematic inefficiencies that were costing the firm money or exposing us to unnecessary risk. Each time, I developed solutions based on peer-reviewed research and quantitative analysis. I could see James Morrison shaking his head slightly, not in disagreement but in what appeared to be amazement. We had worked together on several projects, but clearly he hadn't understood the full scope of the analytical framework I brought to my work. Last year, when the Federal Reserve began signaling interest rate changes, I developed a predictive model for how different rate scenarios would affect our entire fixed income portfolio, I said, my voice carrying the authority that comes from discussing work you've done exceptionally well. The model incorporated not just the direct effects of rate changes, but the behavioral responses of different investor classes, the likely policy reactions from emerging market central banks, and the probable changes in cross-currency volatility patterns. Cassandra had gone completely silent now. Her earlier confidence evaporated in the face of the detailed professional competencies I was outlining. This wasn't the story of someone who had charmed her way into a position. This was the resume of someone who had systematically outperformed at every level. The rate change predictions proved 94% accurate over the following 12 months, I concluded, and the portfolio adjustments I recommended based on those predictions generated an additional $47 million in returns while reducing our duration risk by 42%. The numbers hung in the air like a challenge. $47 million wasn't just impressive performance, it was the kind of value creation that justified not just promotions, but significant bonuses and industry recognition. What I was about to reveal next would make it clear that my promotion to Senior Investment Analyst wasn't just deserved, it was probably long overdue. The atmosphere in our corner of the party had shifted dramatically. What had started as Cassandra's public attempt to diminish my achievements had transformed into something entirely different, a masterclass in professional competence that was making everyone present reconsider their assumptions about merit and recognition in our industry. But I wasn't finished. If Cassandra wanted to make my qualifications a matter of public discussion, then she was going to hear about all of them. Now, let me address the specific credentials you mentioned earlier, I said, my voice taking on the measured tone I used during client presentations. You talked about CFAs and MBAs, about the years of grinding work that others have put in. Let me share some details about my own professional development that might interest you. I could see Linda Thornfield checking her watch, not from impatience but from what appeared to be professional curiosity about how long I was prepared to continue this detailed accounting of my background. Around us, the holiday party continued, but our corner had become its own separate universe of focused attention. I passed the CFA Level 1 examination during my final semester of graduate school, I began, scoring in the 95th percentile despite preparing for it while completing my master's thesis and working 20 hours a week as a research assistant. Most candidates spend 6 to 9 months studying full-time for Level 1. I had 4 months while managing multiple other commitments. Cassandra's face had taken on a slightly glazed expression, as if she was beginning to realize that this conversation was not going to end the way she had anticipated. Several of the junior analysts in our audience were taking mental notes. This was probably the most detailed breakdown of professional achievement they had ever heard delivered in real time. I completed CFA Level 2 6 months after joining Pinnacle, I continued, again scoring in the 95th percentile. For those who aren't familiar with the CFA program, Level 2 has a pass rate of approximately 35%. It requires mastery of advanced financial analysis, equity valuation, fixed income analytics, derivatives, alternative investments, and portfolio management theory. Robert Crawford was nodding with what appeared to be genuine respect. He had earned his CFA designation 15 years earlier and would understand exactly how challenging the Level 2 examination was, particularly for someone who was simultaneously learning a new job at a demanding firm. I completed the CFA Level 3 examination, and became a CFA charter holder, 18 months ago, I said, my voice carrying the quiet confidence that comes from discussing achievements you've earned through sustained effort. The Level 3 pass rate is typically around 50%, but it's considered the most challenging because it requires not just knowledge but the ability to synthesize complex information and make strategic recommendations under time pressure. I paused, letting the weight of that accomplishment settle. There were approximately 200,000 CFA charter holders worldwide out of millions of finance professionals. It wasn't just a credential, it was evidence of sustained intellectual rigor and professional commitment. In addition to the CFA designation, I continued, I hold Series 7, 63, and 66 licenses, as well as advanced certifications in quantitative risk management and behavioral finance from the International Association of Financial Engineers. I've completed postgraduate coursework in machine learning applications to financial markets, and I'm fluent in Python, R, and MATLAB for quantitative analysis. The technical specificity of what I was describing was clearly making an impression on our audience. These weren't just alphabet soup credentials, they represented hundreds of hours of study and examination, each building on advanced mathematical and theoretical foundations. But credentials are just the foundation, I said, shifting from academic achievements to practical performance. What matters in this industry is results. So let me tell you about the work I've actually done at Pinnacle Financial over the past 3 years. I could see James Morrison leaning forward with increased interest. He had collaborated with me on several projects, but clearly hadn't understood the full analytical framework underlying my contributions. During my second year here, I identified a systematic pricing inefficiency in the municipal bond market, I said, my voice taking on the enthusiasm that always emerged when I discussed my research. Municipal bonds from certain issuers were being systematically underpriced relative to their actual default risk, creating arbitrage opportunities for investors who understood the underlying credit fundamentals. Linda Thornfield's expression sharpened with interest. Municipal bond arbitrage was notoriously difficult to execute profitably, requiring sophisticated understanding of local government finances, tax policy, and political risk assessment. I developed a proprietary screening model that analyzed over 3,000 municipal issuers across 47 states, I continued, incorporating not just traditional credit metrics but also demographic trends, local economic indicators, and political stability measures. The model identified 43 specific bonds that were trading at significant discounts to their fundamental value. The crowd around us had grown larger, drawn by the increasingly technical discussion. Even some of the senior partners who had been mingling near the executive area were drifting closer, clearly intrigued by the detailed financial analysis being presented at what was supposed to be a social event. I presented my findings to the investment committee with a recommendation to allocate $85 million to a targeted municipal bond strategy based on my analysis, I said, remembering the intensity of that presentation, the careful scrutiny of my methodology by some of the most experienced investors in the firm. The committee approved the allocation after a rigorous review of my analytical framework, I continued, and over the following 18 months, the municipal bond positions I identified generated returns of 23.7% compared to 11.2% for the broader municipal bond index. The strategy produced $11.8 million in additional returns above what we would have earned from index investing. Several people in our audience shifted with surprise. An $11 million outperformance wasn't just successful investing, it was the kind of value creation that could define a professional reputation and justify significant compensation. But that was just one example, I said, warming to the subject as I always did when discussing successful analytical work. During the same period, I redesigned our approach to corporate credit analysis, incorporating real-time sentiment analysis from earnings call transcripts and social media discussions to identify early warning signs of credit deterioration. Cassandra had gone completely pale now, her earlier confidence replaced by what appeared to be mounting horror as she realized the full scope of the professional competencies she had so casually dismissed. The enhanced credit model identified 3 companies in our portfolio that were showing early signs of financial stress 6 to 8 months before traditional credit metrics would have flagged the risk, I continued. We reduced our exposure to those positions, avoiding $4.2 million in losses when those companies subsequently experienced credit downgrades. The silence around us was now complete, broken only by the distant sound of the ongoing party and the soft whir of the building's ventilation system. Even the catering staff seemed to have slowed their circulation, clearly aware that something significant was unfolding in our corner of the celebration. What I was about to reveal next would demonstrate that my recent promotion wasn't just justified by my past performance, it was probably the minimum recognition that my contributions deserved. The holiday party around us had taken on a surreal quality. While conversations continued and laughter echoed from the main gathering, our corner had become an island of intense focus where careers and reputations hung in the balance. I could see Harrison Blackstone himself moving through the crowd toward us, his silver hair catching the light as he navigated between clusters of guests with the purposeful stride of someone who had heard enough fragments of our conversation to demand the full story. Now that we've established the foundation of my qualifications, I said, my voice carrying across our ever-growing audience with newfound authority, let me tell you about the project that apparently convinced the executive committee I was ready for senior analyst responsibilities. Cassandra's grip on her empty martini glass had become almost white-knuckled, and I could see her beginning to understand that every assumption she had made about my career trajectory was not just wrong, but spectacularly, publicly wrong. 6 months ago, Pinnacle Financial was approached by Meridian Pension Fund to manage a $340 million allocation across emerging market debt, high-yield corporates, and alternative credit strategies. I began, noting how Robert Crawford's attention sharpened immediately. He would remember this engagement. It was one of the largest new mandates the firm had secured in recent years. The challenge wasn't just the size of the allocation, I continued, but the complexity of the client's requirements. Meridian needed a portfolio that could generate consistent income while protecting against three specific risk scenarios: a Federal Reserve tightening cycle, a European sovereign debt crisis, and a hard landing in Chinese economic growth. I could see several of the senior associates in our audience exchanging glances. Building a portfolio that could perform well across such diverse stress scenarios required sophisticated understanding of global macro relationships and correlation dynamics that most analysts spent years developing. Linda Thornfield assigned the project to our team, I said, acknowledging my department head with a slight nod, but the initial portfolio recommendations were struggling to meet the client's risk-return requirements. Traditional optimization approaches were producing allocations that looked good on paper but failed stress testing under realistic scenario analysis. James Morrison was nodding now, clearly remembering the early stages of the project when multiple team members had struggled to develop a coherent investment framework that could satisfy Meridian's complex requirements. That's when I proposed a completely different approach, I said, my voice taking on the enthusiasm that always emerged when I discussed innovative analytical work. Instead of building a portfolio based on historical correlations and expected returns, I suggested we construct it using real-time stress testing across dynamically modeled economic scenarios. The technical complexity of what I was describing was clearly registering with the more experienced professionals in our audience. Dynamic scenario modeling wasn't just advanced portfolio theory, it was cutting-edge methodology that most institutional investors were still trying to understand and implement. I spent 3 weeks building a Monte Carlo simulation framework that could model how different asset classes would behave under thousands of possible combinations of economic conditions, I continued, remembering the long nights spent coding and testing the analytical models. The system incorporated not just traditional economic variables like interest rates and credit spreads, but also behavioral factors like investor sentiment, liquidity preferences, and risk appetite clustering. Linda Thornfield had moved closer now, her expression shifting from professional interest to something approaching pride as she listened to me detail the sophisticated analytical work that had been completed under her department's supervision. The simulation framework identified several counterintuitive portfolio allocations that traditional optimization would never have suggested, I said, warming to the technical discussion. For example, it recommended a 15% allocation to emerging market local currency bonds, not despite their volatility, but because their correlation patterns with other assets actually decreased during stress periods, providing diversification benefits exactly when they were most needed. Several people in our audience were clearly struggling to follow the technical details, but Robert Crawford was nodding with obvious appreciation. He would understand that discovering negative correlation patterns during stress periods was like finding financial gold, assets that provided protection exactly when traditional hedges failed. The framework also identified opportunities in distressed European corporate debt, I continued, but only from issuers in specific sectors with strong cash generation and low refinancing requirements. The model showed that these securities would actually benefit from a European sovereign debt crisis as investors fled government bonds and sought higher-yielding corporate alternatives. Cassandra had gone completely silent now, her earlier confidence replaced by what appeared to be growing horror as she realized the sophistication of the analytical work she had so casually dismissed. This wasn't just competent portfolio management. This was the kind of innovative thinking that typically came from PhD-level researchers or senior portfolio managers with decades of experience. After 6 weeks of development and testing, I presented the portfolio framework to Meridian's investment committee, I said, remembering the intensity of that presentation, facing a room full of institutional investors who managed billions in pension assets and were notoriously skeptical of new methodologies. The presentation lasted 3 hours, I continued, with detailed questions about every aspect of the analytical framework, stress testing results, and implementation mechanics. The committee members included former Federal Reserve officials, university endowment managers, and sovereign wealth fund executives, people who had seen every possible approach to portfolio construction and were not easily impressed by academic theory. Harrison Blackstone had reached the edge of our circle now, his presence adding another layer of gravity to the unfolding situation. As senior partner, he would have been involved in the final approval process for the Meridian mandate and would remember the client's enthusiastic response to our proposal. The committee approved our proposal unanimously, I said, allowing a note of satisfaction to enter my voice, but more importantly, they increased their allocation from $340 million to $480 million based on their confidence in our analytical approach. Meridian's chief investment officer told Harrison directly that it was the most sophisticated portfolio construction methodology they had encountered from any institutional manager. Several people in our audience turned to look at Harrison, who nodded with obvious confirmation. The Meridian engagement had been a significant business development success for the firm, both for the immediate revenue and for the reputational benefits of being recognized as an analytical leader by sophisticated institutional clients. Over the following 6 months, I continued, the portfolio performed exactly as the stress testing had predicted. When the Federal Reserve began their tightening cycle in March, our emerging market local currency positions provided the diversification benefits we had modeled. When European credit spreads widened in June, our distressed corporate bond positions generated significant alpha as investors sought higher-yielding alternatives to government securities. The performance numbers I was about to reveal would demonstrate that this wasn't just theoretical success, it was the kind of practical outperformance that validated innovative analytical approaches and justified the confidence that clients like Meridian had placed in our capabilities. Through the end of October, I said, my voice carrying the quiet confidence that comes from discussing results you know are exceptional, the Meridian portfolio had generated net returns of 18.7% compared to 9.2% for their benchmark allocation. The additional return represented over $45 million in outperformance on their $480 million mandate. The silence that followed was profound. $45 million in outperformance wasn't just successful investing, it was the kind of value creation that could define institutional relationships and establish reputational advantages that lasted for decades. What I was about to reveal next would make it clear that my promotion to Senior Investment Analyst wasn't just recognition of past achievement. It was acknowledgement that I had already demonstrated capabilities typically associated with much more senior positions. The weight of $45 million in outperformance hung in the air like a thunderclap, and I could see the implications registering across the faces surrounding us. This wasn't just impressive performance, this was the kind of value creation that transformed client relationships and elevated institutional reputations. But what happened next would reveal just how dramatically Cassandra had miscalculated the foundation of my professional standing. Following the success of the Meridian mandate, I continued, my voice now carrying the authority of someone who had moved far beyond defending herself to actively demonstrating excellence. Word began to spread through the institutional investor community about our analytical capabilities. I could see Harrison Blackstone nodding with obvious recollection. The business development implications of the Meridian success had been significant, generating inquiries from other sophisticated institutional clients who had heard about our innovative portfolio construction methodology. Within 8 weeks of our initial performance report to Meridian, I said, we received inquiries from 4 additional institutional clients, the Teachers' Retirement System of California, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, Harvard Management Company, and the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. Combined, they were exploring allocations totaling over $2.3 billion. Several people in our audience shifted with surprise. These weren't just large clients, they were among the most sophisticated and selective institutional investors in the world. The fact that they were actively seeking to replicate Meridian's experience represented validation at the highest levels of the investment community. But here's where things became particularly interesting, I continued, my voice taking on the tone of someone building toward a crucial revelation. Each of these potential clients made the same specific request. They wanted to work directly with the analyst who had developed the portfolio construction framework. Cassandra's face had gone completely pale now, and I could see her beginning to understand the implications of what I was describing. This wasn't just about my individual performance, it was about my emergence as a recognized expert whose analytical innovations were driving significant business development for the firm. The Norway meeting was particularly memorable, I said, allowing myself a slight smile at the recollection. Their investment committee included the former governor of the Bank of England, 2 Nobel Prize-winning economists, and the chief investment officers of 3 major sovereign wealth funds. They spent 4 hours reviewing my analytical methodology in exhaustive detail. Linda Thornfield was watching with obvious pride now, clearly remembering the extensive preparation that had gone into those high-stakes client presentations. These weren't routine business meetings, they were academic-level examinations of sophisticated financial theory by some of the most accomplished investors and economists in the world. At the end of the Norway presentation, I continued, Professor Erik Lundberg, the Nobel laureate who chairs their risk committee, stood up and said something I'll never forget. He told the room that in 30 years of academic research and investment committee service, he had rarely encountered portfolio construction methodology that demonstrated such elegant integration of theoretical sophistication and practical implementation. The silence around us was now complete, broken only by the distant sounds of the ongoing party. Even the catering staff had slowed their circulation, clearly sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding in our corner of the celebration. Professor Lundberg asked me if I had considered pursuing a PhD in financial economics. I said, remembering the surreal feeling of being recruited for academic research by a Nobel Prize winner during what was supposed to be a business development meeting. He mentioned that my work on dynamic correlation modeling could form the foundation for significant contributions to behavioral finance literature. Robert Crawford was shaking his head with obvious amazement. The idea that a 3-year analyst was producing work that impressed Nobel laureates represented professional achievement at a level that most people in our industry could only dream about. But the real validation came 3 weeks later, I said, building toward what I knew would be the most impactful revelation of the evening. Harrison received a call from David Chin, the chief investment officer at Harvard Management Company. Harrison's expression confirmed that he remembered the conversation vividly. Harvard Management Company wasn't just another institutional client, they were legendary for their analytical rigor and their track record of identifying and developing exceptional investment talent. David told Harrison that Harvard wanted to offer me a position as a senior portfolio manager. I continued, watching as the implications registered across the faces of our audience. Not an analyst position, not an associate role, a senior portfolio manager position with responsibility for a $800 million emerging markets allocation. The job offer I was describing represented a career leap that typically required 8 to 10 years of progressive experience and demonstrated excellence at multiple institutional levels. The fact that Harvard was willing to offer such a position to someone with 3 years of experience suggested recognition of capabilities that transcended normal career progression. The compensation package, I said quietly, was $340,000 base salary plus performance bonuses that could reach another $500,000 annually. Harvard also offered to fund completion of a PhD in financial economics at MIT, with the understanding that I would apply my research to enhancing their portfolio management capabilities. Several people in our audience were clearly struggling to process what they were hearing. An offer from Harvard Management Company wasn't just attractive compensation, it was recognition as one of the most promising investment professionals of my generation. But here's what's particularly relevant to tonight's conversation, I said, looking directly at Cassandra for the first time in several minutes. David Chin specifically told Harrison that Harvard's interest was based entirely on my published research and demonstrated analytical capabilities. He mentioned that they had never extended a senior portfolio manager offer to someone without an advanced degree, but that my work represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking they were seeking to incorporate into their investment process. Cassandra's grip on her empty martini glass had become almost desperate, as if the physical object was the only thing anchoring her to reality as her carefully constructed narrative about my career collapsed around her. I declined Harvard's offer, I said simply, allowing the weight of that decision to sink in. I told Harrison that I valued the collaborative culture at Pinnacle Financial and believed that my analytical work could have greater impact as part of an integrated team rather than as an individual contributor at a larger institution. Linda Thornfield was smiling now, clearly remembering the conversation when I had informed her of my decision to remain with the firm despite the extraordinary external opportunity. It had been a testament to both my loyalty and my confidence in Pinnacle's long-term potential. Harrison asked me what it would take to ensure that I remained committed to building my career at Pinnacle. I continued, noting how our senior partner nodded with obvious recollection of that pivotal discussion. I told him that I valued recognition based on merit, opportunities for intellectual challenge, and the chance to develop innovative solutions to complex investment problems. What I was about to reveal next would demonstrate that my recent promotion to Senior Investment Analyst wasn't just appropriate recognition for past achievement, it was probably long overdue acknowledgement of capabilities that had already been validated at the highest levels of the institutional investment community. The crisis point was approaching, and Cassandra was about to discover that her public challenge hadn't just been wrong, it had been catastrophically, irreversibly wrong in front of the most important witnesses possible. The revelation about Harvard's offer had created a palpable shift in the atmosphere around us. I could see colleagues processing the implications, not just that I had received such an extraordinary opportunity, but that I had chosen to decline it in favor of remaining at Pinnacle Financial. The dynamics of power and recognition that had seemed so clear to Cassandra just minutes earlier were now completely inverted. 3 days after I declined Harvard's offer, I continued, my voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had reached the culmination of a long story. Harrison scheduled a meeting with Linda, Robert, and myself to discuss my future with the firm. I could see all three of them in our audience now, Harrison at the edge of our circle, Robert Crawford listening intently, and Linda Thornfield watching with obvious pride as the full scope of my professional trajectory became clear to everyone present. The meeting lasted 2 hours, I said, remembering the intensity of that pivotal conversation. Harrison began by acknowledging that Pinnacle had been fortunate to recruit someone with my analytical capabilities, but that they had underestimated the speed at which my contributions would impact both our investment performance and our business development efforts. Cassandra had set her empty martini glass down on a nearby table, her hands now clasped in front of her as if she were trying to physically hold herself together while her assumptions continued to crumble around her. Robert presented a detailed analysis of my performance metrics over the previous 18 months, I continued, noting how our managing director nodded with confirmation. The portfolios I had designed or significantly influenced were outperforming their benchmarks by an average of 8.3% annually. The analytical frameworks I had developed were being adopted across multiple departments. The business development pipeline had expanded by $1.8 billion in potential mandates, with clients specifically requesting my involvement. The numbers I was citing weren't just impressive, they represented the kind of systematic value creation that typically justified partnership track consideration rather than routine promotions. Several of the senior associates in our audience were clearly realizing that they had been working alongside someone whose contributions far exceeded what they had understood. But the most significant discussion centered on something that none of my colleagues knew, I said, building toward what I knew would be the most impactful revelation of the evening. Harrison told me that 3 additional institutional clients had approached the firm with unsolicited offers to poach me. The silence around us deepened even further. Unsolicited poaching attempts weren't just flattering professional attention, they represented market validation that my capabilities were being recognized and valued across the institutional investment community. The offers were from Wellington Management, BlackRock, and Bridgewater Associates, I said, noting how several people in our audience drew sharp breaths. These weren't just large asset management firms, they were legendary institutions that recruited only the most exceptional talent and paid compensation packages that reflected the enormous value they placed on analytical excellence. Wellington's offer was particularly interesting, I continued, my voice taking on the tone of someone discussing opportunities that transcended normal career progression. They wanted to create a new emerging markets research group around my analytical methodology, with me as the lead portfolio manager overseeing a $2 billion mandate. The compensation package started at $450,000 base with performance bonuses that could exceed $800,000 annually. Robert Crawford was shaking his head with obvious amazement. Wellington Management was known for their rigorous analytical culture and their track record of developing some of the most successful institutional investors in the industry. An offer to lead a new research group represented recognition at a level that most professionals achieved only after decades of progressive experience. Bridgewater's approach was even more extraordinary, I said, remembering the surreal phone conversation with their chief investment officer. They offered me a position as a senior research analyst working directly with Ray Dalio on macroeconomic portfolio construction. They wanted to incorporate my dynamic correlation modeling into their flagship Pure Alpha strategy. Several people in our audience were clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what I was describing. Bridgewater Associates wasn't just another hedge fund, they managed over $150 billion and were known for recruiting only the most intellectually exceptional analysts from the entire global finance community. But here's what's most relevant to our conversation tonight, I said, turning my attention back to Cassandra, who had gone completely pale and appeared to be regretting every word she had spoken earlier. Each of these firms made their approaches based entirely on my analytical work and published research. None of them had ever met me in person. Their interest was driven purely by the sophistication of my mathematical frameworks and the practical results those frameworks had generated. The implications were devastating for Cassandra's narrative. The idea that multiple legendary institutions were competing for my services based solely on intellectual merit completely undermined any suggestion that my career advancement was based on anything other than exceptional professional capabilities. Harrison asked me directly what Pinnacle Financial could offer that would compete with these external opportunities. I continued, noting how our senior partner nodded with obvious recollection of that crucial conversation. I told him that I valued institutional loyalty, collaborative culture, and the opportunity to build something lasting rather than simply maximizing short-term compensation. Linda Thornfield was smiling openly now, clearly remembering my decision to prioritize long-term professional development over immediate financial gain. It had been a choice that reflected both maturity and confidence in my own capabilities. But I also told him that I expected recognition commensurate with my contributions, I said, my voice taking on a firmer tone. I pointed out that my analytical innovations had generated over $60 million in additional returns for our clients, had attracted nearly $2 billion in new business development, and had established Pinnacle Financial as a recognized leader in sophisticated portfolio construction methodology. The $60 million figure represented cumulative outperformance across all the portfolios I had influenced, but hearing it stated as a single number made the scale of my value creation impossible to ignore. Several people in our audience were clearly realizing that they had been working alongside someone whose contributions represented a significant percentage of the firm's total profitability. Harrison's response was immediate and unequivocal, I said, building toward the climax of this extended professional narrative. He told me that Pinnacle Financial would create a new senior analyst position specifically designed around my capabilities, with compensation competitive with external offers, direct reporting to the executive committee, and authority to develop and implement analytical frameworks across all investment strategies. What I was about to reveal next would demonstrate that my recent promotion wasn't just recognition of exceptional performance, it was the firm's strategic response to market validation of capabilities that had attracted interest from the most prestigious institutions in the investment industry. The power dynamic between Cassandra and myself had been completely reversed, and what remained was for her to understand the full implications of her catastrophic miscalculation. The champagne in my abandoned glass had long since gone flat, but the clarity of the moment was crystalline. Around us, the holiday party continued its elegant rhythm, but our corner had become something entirely different, a stage where professional assumptions were being systematically dismantled and rebuilt in real time. The promotion announcement this morning, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had moved far beyond defense into demonstration of excellence, was actually the culmination of 6 months of strategic planning by the executive committee. Harrison Blackstone stepped forward slightly, his presence lending additional gravity to what I was about to reveal. As senior partner, he would have been intimately involved in the discussions about my future role and the firm's long-term strategic positioning around my analytical capabilities. The new Senior Investment Analyst position wasn't just a routine promotion, I continued, noting how Linda Thornfield nodded with obvious confirmation. It was specifically designed to retain and leverage capabilities that had been validated by some of the most sophisticated institutional investors in the world. Cassandra remained frozen in place, her earlier confidence replaced by what appeared to be mounting horror as she realized that her public challenge hadn't just been wrong, it had been catastrophically wrong in front of the most important witnesses possible. The compensation package reflects external market validation, I said, allowing myself a slight smile at the irony of discussing financial details at what was supposed to be a social celebration. Base salary of $185,000, performance bonuses up to $150,000 annually, and equity participation in the firm's growth, compensation that's competitive with offers from Wellington, BlackRock, and Bridgewater. Several people in our audience shifted with surprise. The numbers I was citing weren't just generous. They represented compensation typically reserved for senior portfolio managers or junior partners, reflecting the firm's recognition that my contributions transcended normal analyst responsibilities. But more importantly, I continued, my voice taking on the enthusiasm that always emerged when I discussed strategic opportunities, the new position includes authority to establish a quantitative research group that will develop and implement analytical frameworks across all of Pinnacle's investment strategies. Robert Crawford was nodding with obvious enthusiasm now, clearly anticipating the strategic advantages that sophisticated analytical capabilities could provide across the firm's diverse client base and investment approaches. The research group will have 3 full-time analysts reporting directly to me, I said, outlining the scope of the organizational changes that had been developed around my promotion. We'll be responsible for enhancing risk management across all portfolios, developing innovative solutions for client-specific requirements, and maintaining Pinnacle's competitive advantage in sophisticated institutional mandates. The magnitude of what I was describing was clearly registering across our audience. This wasn't just a promotion, it was the creation of an entirely new organizational capability designed around my proven track record of analytical innovation and practical implementation. Harrison also announced that Pinnacle Financial will be sponsoring completion of my PhD in financial economics. I continued, noting how our senior partner smiled with obvious pride at the firm's investment in long-term intellectual development. The doctoral program will be completed part-time over 4 years, with research focused on practical applications of behavioral finance theory to institutional portfolio management. Linda Thornfield was beaming now, clearly proud of the strategic vision that had transformed my individual success into a broader organizational capability. The decision to support advanced academic credentials while retaining my practical contributions represented sophisticated human capital management at the highest levels. The PhD sponsorship includes full tuition coverage, research support, and sabbatical time for dissertation completion, I said, outlining the comprehensive nature of the firm's commitment to my long-term professional development. Upon completion, I'll become Pinnacle's first director of quantitative research, with partnership track consideration and equity participation reflecting my contributions to the firm's strategic positioning. What I was describing wasn't just career advancement, it was a transformation from individual contributor to institutional leader, with recognition and compensation reflecting the extraordinary value creation I had demonstrated over 3 years of systematic excellence. But perhaps most importantly, I said, turning my attention directly to Cassandra for the first time in several minutes, the executive committee specifically discussed the importance of merit-based recognition and the firm's commitment to evaluating contributions based purely on analytical capabilities and practical results. The implications were devastating for everything Cassandra had suggested earlier. The firm's leadership hadn't just recognized my contributions, they had explicitly structured my advancement around intellectual merit and documented performance, creating organizational frameworks that would ensure similar recognition for future analytical excellence. Harrison mentioned during our final discussion that Pinnacle Financial's reputation in the institutional community had been significantly enhanced by our demonstrated analytical capabilities. I continued, my voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone whose work had achieved recognition at the highest levels of professional accomplishment. 3 of the industry's most prestigious conferences have invited me to present research on dynamic portfolio construction methodology, I said, noting how Robert Crawford nodded with obvious pride. The presentations will position Pinnacle Financial as a thought leader in sophisticated analytical approaches, generating business development opportunities that could translate into billions in additional assets under management. Cassandra had gone completely silent now, her earlier accusations transformed into what appeared to be professional humiliation as the full scope of my validated capabilities became clear to everyone present. The speaking engagements include the Global Investment Research Conference in London, the Institutional Investor Summit in New York, and the Nobel Prize Economic Sciences Symposium in Stockholm, I continued, outlining opportunities that represented the pinnacle of recognition in our industry. But here's what I want everyone to understand about tonight's conversation, I said, my voice taking on the firm but compassionate tone of someone who had moved beyond personal vindication to broader professional principles. Cassandra's assumptions weren't just wrong about my specific qualifications and achievements. They represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how excellence is recognized and rewarded in our industry. The silence around us was now profound, broken only by the distant sounds of the ongoing party and the soft rhythm of the building's ventilation system. Even the catering staff had completely abandoned any pretense of circulation, clearly recognizing that something extraordinary was concluding in our corner of the celebration. What remained was for me to demonstrate that this confrontation wasn't about personal revenge or professional dominance. It was about establishing principles that would ensure merit-based recognition for everyone who demonstrated exceptional capabilities, regardless of their background, appearance, or any other irrelevant characteristics. The holiday party around us had taken on an almost dreamlike quality, with conversations and laughter continuing in the distance while our corner existed in its own bubble of profound silence. The weight of everything that had been revealed hung in the air like the aftermath of a thunderstorm, electric, transformative, and impossible to ignore. I looked around at the faces surrounding us, colleagues who had worked with me for 3 years but were seeing me clearly for perhaps the first time. James Morrison, who had collaborated on numerous projects but never understood the analytical depth I brought to our work. Sarah Chen from accounting, whose expression had shifted from curiosity to genuine respect. The junior analysts who typically followed Cassandra's lead, now studying their shoes with uncomfortable intensity. You know what the most important lesson from tonight is? I said, my voice carrying across our circle with the authority that comes from having demonstrated rather than simply claimed competence. It's not about my specific achievements or qualifications. It's about the dangerous assumptions we make when we reduce someone's professional success to simplistic explanations that make us more comfortable with our own limitations. Cassandra remained frozen in place, her empty martini glass abandoned on a nearby table, her earlier confidence completely evaporated in the face of the systematic dismantling of every assumption she had made about my career trajectory. When Cassandra suggested that my promotion was based on my appearance rather than my merit, I continued, she wasn't just insulting me. She was insulting every person involved in that decision, Linda Thornfield, Robert Crawford, Harrison Blackstone, the entire executive committee. She was suggesting that this firm, which manages over $12 billion in client assets, makes senior personnel decisions based on factors that would constitute professional misconduct. Harrison Blackstone stepped forward, his expression grave as the full implications of the evening's revelations settled over our gathering. Natasha raises an important point, he said, his voice carrying the weight of senior partnership authority. The suggestions made earlier tonight reflect assumptions about our firm's professional standards that I find deeply troubling. Linda Thornfield nodded with obvious agreement. More importantly, she added, they reflect attitudes that have no place in a merit-based organization. We promote people based on results, analytical capabilities, and demonstrated value creation. Period. I could see Cassandra beginning to understand that this conversation had moved far beyond a personal dispute. Her public challenge hadn't just been wrong, it had called into question the fundamental integrity of the firm's decision-making processes and professional culture. But here's what I want everyone to take away from tonight, I said, my voice taking on the instructional tone I use during client presentations when explaining complex analytical frameworks. Excellence isn't defined by background, connections, or appearance. It's defined by results, by innovation, by the ability to solve problems that others can't solve. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the faces of our audience, many of whom were clearly processing lessons that extended far beyond the specifics of my personal story. I grew up in Riverside Heights, where most families considered high school graduation an achievement, I continued, returning to the themes that had opened my narrative hours earlier. My parents worked multiple jobs to afford my SAT prep courses. I earned my way into graduate school through academic performance, not family connections. I built my career through analytical innovation and documented results, not through networking or shortcuts. The contrast with Cassandra's inherited advantages couldn't have been more stark, and several people in our audience seemed to be reflecting on their own assumptions about merit and opportunity in professional settings. The CFA designation, the published research, the client performance, the institutional recognition, none of that was handed to me, I said, my voice gaining strength as I outlined the systematic nature of the excellence I had demonstrated. It was earned through sustained effort, intellectual rigor, and commitment to producing results that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Robert Crawford stepped forward, clearly feeling the need to add his perspective as managing director. What Natasha has accomplished in 3 years typically requires 8 to 10 years of progressive experience, he said. The analytical frameworks she's developed are being studied by Nobel laureates. The investment performance she's generated has attracted billions in new business development. But perhaps most importantly, Harrison added, she's done all of this while maintaining the collaborative spirit and institutional loyalty that define our firm's culture. She declined multiple offers from prestigious competitors because she believed in our collective mission and wanted to build something lasting rather than maximizing short-term personal gain. I felt a surge of gratitude for their public support, but also recognition that this moment represented something larger than individual vindication. The reason I'm sharing all of this tonight, I said, addressing not just Cassandra but everyone within earshot, is because too many talented people, especially women, especially people from non-traditional backgrounds, face exactly the kind of dismissive assumptions we heard earlier. Their achievements get explained away, their qualifications get questioned, their success gets attributed to everything except the most obvious explanation: they earned it. The silence around us was now complete, with even the distant party noise seeming to fade as my words carried across our corner of the celebration. If you've ever been told that you don't belong, that your success was unearned, that your achievements were due to factors other than your capabilities, I continued, my voice taking on the inspirational cadence that had characterized the most meaningful moments of my graduate school presentations, I want you to remember tonight. Remember that excellence speaks louder than assumptions. Results matter more than perceptions. And competence, when demonstrated consistently and systematically, becomes impossible to dismiss. I looked directly at Cassandra one final time, my expression carrying compassion rather than triumph. I hope you've learned something tonight about the danger of underestimating people based on superficial observations. But more importantly, I hope you've learned something about the importance of building others up rather than tearing them down. Cassandra nodded slowly, her face flushed with what appeared to be genuine embarrassment and perhaps the beginning of understanding about how fundamentally wrong her assumptions had been. And for everyone else, I said, turning back to our broader audience, remember that true professional success comes from lifting each other up, from recognizing and celebrating excellence wherever we find it, and from building organizations where merit is the only currency that matters. The applause began slowly, starting with Linda Thornfield and spreading across our entire corner of the party. But it wasn't just polite acknowledgement, it was the kind of sustained recognition reserved for moments when someone has articulated truths that needed to be spoken. As the applause died down and conversations began to resume, I realized that tonight had changed more than just my relationship with my colleagues. It had established principles about merit, recognition, and professional respect that would influence our workplace culture for years to come. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated isn't anger or revenge, it's demonstrating your capabilities so clearly and comprehensively that assumptions become impossible to maintain. And if this story resonates with you, if you've ever faced professional dismissal based on superficial judgments, remember that your worth isn't defined by others' inability to see it. It's defined by your results, your innovation, your commitment to excellence, and your determination to prove that merit will always triumph over prejudice. Excellence, when demonstrated with consistency and integrity, becomes its own form of justice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.